there, this is Ross Izzard. This is the Backcountry Fly Fishing Podcast, where we talk about fly fishing in more interesting places with terrestrial patterns. So, this week's episode is all about terrestrials. Now, we've had episodes about dry flies and about caddis flies and about mayflies, and we've talked about terrestrials and hoppers in some form or fashion over several episodes, primarily in the context of learning about bugs and fly tying and all that kind of nerdy stuff. But we've never really fully gotten deep into the world of terrestrial fly fishing. And that's really a shame because terrestrials are like the best thing ever for those of us who like dry fly fishing. I wait all year for them, to be perfectly honest with you. I mean, I don't mind. Well, I do mind nymphing, so I'm not going to lie about that, but I do it when I have to. I don't mind throwing elk hair caddis. I don't mind throwing royal wolf. I don't mind throwing mayfly patterns. I don't even mind throwing midge patterns sometimes, like a Griffith's gnat or something like that, if I really, really have to. Now, I have to really, really have to. I don't do that on purpose. Midge fishing is not something that one just does on purpose, at least not if one is sane and self-respecting. But sometimes I'll do that. But while I'm doing all of that, I'm usually thinking, man, I'd really rather just put on a hopper. I would really rather have a terrestrial on my line here. And there are a few reasons for that we can get into as we talk about it. But one of the things that occurred to me is that we've never done a full episode completely about terrestrial bugs. And that is what we're going to do today. Before we get into that, as always, please take the time to review the show. If you're enjoying it, 5 stars always helps on whichever podcast platform you happen to be listening on. I do love hearing from you. I'm getting more and more emails from you all and DMs and everything else, including some really thoughtful engagement. And some folks who, have some things to say that may not agree with what I think. And that's awesome. I really love hearing from you. So keep that up. Don't forget to follow the podcast and subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss an episode. We're going to be working on this season for a couple more months here still, so there's plenty of fun to have. And if you have anything that you would like to hear on the podcast or a question that you'd like answered, please feel free to send that to me at backcountryflyfishingpodcast@gmail.com or on Instagram on the Backcountry Fly Fishing Podcast Instagram page. I've gotten a lot of really interesting questions that probably will turn into episode ideas at some point, and even if they don't, might turn into interesting things for me to answer on an episode when they come up. So please keep those coming. Appreciate all of you. Now, let's talk about terrestrials. Now, let's first start with a definition. You guys know I love my definitions of what the hell a terrestrial is, because there is some confusion about this, believe it or not. Terrestrial refers, in fly fishing at least, to any type of bug that doesn't primarily hatch or live in the water. Okay, so think about most of your nymphs. So most of your caddisfly nymphs, they're living underwater for a long period of time. Then they're hatching, and then the adults come out. They fly around, and then they lay their eggs, and usually they die, and they fall back in the water. Same with mayflies. Same with stoneflies. Now, importantly, these bugs do leave the water. So you may see caddisflies or mayflies or stoneflies crawling around on the bank, crawling around on a rock, sitting in a tree, sitting in a bush. That definitely happens. But just the fact that the adult form goes to the land after it hatches doesn't change the fact that these are aquatic insects. Okay, they live and they die in the water, which is why nymphs are so effective, because we are imitating the aquatic young phase of these bugs. Terrestrials are different. They hatch on land and they live entirely on land. So you don't usually see these things. First of all, you definitely don't see them in the water because they would drown. They don't have gills. Second of all, they really would prefer not to be in the water at all. They live completely on land. That's where they spend their entire lives. They're a totally different type of insect. And as a result, they sort of fish a little bit differently than some of your aquatic insects. The most notable thing is they don't have nymphal forms, right? So you're never going to throw a grasshopper larva or nymph into the water. You're not going to throw a beetle larva into the water. You're definitely not going to throw ant eggs into the water. It just wouldn't be effective. Trout don't really eat that. The bugs don't do that. You might get a couple fish to eat it because let's be real. I mean, trout are not all that sophisticated and they sometimes make mistakes. But for the most part, that's not very effective. So really you're talking about terrestrial bugs that live on land, primarily grasshoppers, ants, and beetles, that somehow find themselves in the water. Now, this could be that they jump and they miss a blade of grass or a leaf and they land in the water. Could be a big gust of wind that picks them up and throws them in the water. It could be, who knows, a flood of some kind or rising water conditions or a million things that could get them in the water. But they're going to land in the water and then they're floating in the water, right? They're usually buoyant, which means terrestrials are dry flies, at least as far as how we imitate them in fly fishing. So we're not talking about caddis patterns. We're not talking about mayfly patterns. We're not talking about stonefly patterns, even the really big stonefly patterns that sort of look like terrestrials. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about bugs that live specifically on the land and then get imitated as dry flies in the water. Now, this gets kind of dorky, right? Because bugs are weird and hatch timing is weird. And so there's always a question about when we should start paying attention to terrestrials as an important food source for trout. And that can vary based on where you are. And it varies on factors that are a little bit different than what we see in the aquatic insect universe, right? So usually with aquatic insects, obviously most of their life cycle is governed by water temperature. It's not necessarily governed by air temperature or how warm it is outside. It's governed by water temperature. And once the water starts warming up, especially into the 40s, you will start seeing more and more hatches of aquatic insects because the water temperature is now conducive to them hatching. However, terrestrial insects are not governed by water temperatures because, again, terrestrial, meaning of the earth, they live on land, so they don't care about that stuff. What they do care about is soil temperatures, which is something that we almost never really talk about as fly anglers. But these bugs primarily start to hatch when soil temperatures reach a certain threshold. Now, for grasshoppers, which is arguably the most well-known and I think the most fun form of terrestrial insect, they start hatching when the soil temperatures reach somewhere around 50 to 55 degrees. And that's when you start seeing some hatches. These hatches don't look like a caddis hatch. They're not all over the place and flying around like crazy. They look like little tiny versions of the bug. So sticking with the grasshopper example, because I think they're the most illustrative of all this stuff, these nymphs, so to speak, even though they're not aquatic nymphs, so don't get confused. These nymphs are basically just tiny adult grasshoppers. So if you've ever seen like a little tiny grasshopper that would fit on like the end of a pencil or on an eraser, that is a young grasshopper. It's actually a grasshopper nymph. It has hatched because the soil temperatures have reached the appropriate level, usually between 50 and 55. And once they have grown, they will become full-blown grasshoppers. Now, this is where it gets interesting, okay? Hopper season doesn't really start when the first tiny grasshopper, and by the way, I'm going to back up for a second. I'm going to call it hopper season because for reasons I will describe shortly, I really don't fish a lot of ant or beetle patterns. Doesn't mean you can't, doesn't mean they're not important. I know that people swear by them, but I'm really a hopper guy. So terrestrial season for me means hopper season to me. Now, with that aside, here's the thing. Hopper season doesn't start when the grasshoppers first appear, when you have those teeny tiny grasshoppers jumping around on the banks. Those little tiny grasshoppers still need to grow. They're not really an important food source for the trout at that stage, which is why you don't see a lot of people selling like size 18 or size 20 grasshopper dry flies. Could you throw one on and maybe catch some fish with it? Yeah, probably. Is it the most effective fly pattern that you could use at that stage if you're trying to be in sync with the ecology of the river? Probably not. They take some time to mature. So usually in a normal year, you're talking about these eggs starting to hatch in April or May. So you're going to start seeing at least small grasshoppers on the banks in April and May. Then by the end of May or June, sometimes a little bit earlier, depending on conditions, you're going to start seeing larger grasshoppers. And they may not be the huge, like 1 inch long, great granddaddy grasshoppers. They might just be half an inch long or a 1/4 inch long, but they're getting bigger and they're starting to look like actual bugs. Once you start seeing those really in any kind of numbers, you know that you have entered terrestrial season, or as I call it, hopper season. They grow from there, and by July-ish, usually they've peaked as far as size, and then they run all the way through July, August, and part of September before the cold weather comes in and actually kills them and puts an end to the grasshopper season, usually by the end of September or the beginning of October. But this is not a set timeline. Okay. And so I want you to hear me on that. There are a lot of people in the fly fishing community that will tell you if you're out there fishing hoppers in April or May, you're too early. That's silly. You need to save them for actual summer. And that's true sometimes. It's not true all the time. So, for instance, I was out fishing in April and in early May with hoppers to great effect. Why? Well, we have had an astonishingly warm winter and an astonishingly warm spring out here in Colorado where I live, which means that those soil temperatures reached the hatching temp earlier. The grasshoppers hatched earlier, and they really started hatching in, like, believe it or not, late March or early April. So now, by the time we get to late April or May, you're starting to get grasshoppers that are sizable enough to be a real food source for the trout. And so it's now a viable solution to be fishing hoppers in April or May, which is rad, right? Now, we don't want to, it might not be rad if you want to spend time thinking about the implications for the climate, what this might mean. But from a fishing perspective, it's awesome to be fishing hoppers already. And it really is going to come down to what you observe out there. So don't let anybody tell you, it's too early. Don't do that till July. Don't do that till August. That's a sort of easy truism to throw around. It's really not reflective of what's actually going on. Nature doesn't care about you or your timelines. It doesn't run on a schedule. If you are seeing hoppers on the bank that are big enough to look like they could be a fly pattern, you probably are in a place where you can start fishing hopper patterns or terrestrial patterns of any kind. So once you've gotten that, once you've sort of identified this and said, aha, it's hopper season, what do you use to imitate these terrestrials? And for this, I'll go back to those initial 3 terrestrial categories, the big ones: hoppers, ants, and beetles. Now, are there other patterns and other types of bugs out there? Yes, there are spider patterns. There are water boatman patterns. There are all kinds of mouse patterns and other stuff out there. Mice are obviously not insects, but they are a land animal, and so they sort of fit to some extent in this same weird category. So I'm not saying these are the only ones, but these are the most common ones. And as with all common fly patterns, there are 20 billion variations of these things that can be kind of hard to track. So listen, I could give you a big long list of patterns in each of these categories, and they all probably will work, right? But I really have over the years narrowed down my fly selection to a few patterns that really, really work for me. And by work for me, I mean they're effective. Obviously, I want them to catch fish. I would like them to be easy enough to tie that I'm not going insane trying to tie a million of these things all the time. And I want them to be effective enough in a wide enough variety of water that I don't have to carry 15 different iterations or colors or anything else. So I've really narrowed down my fly selection to just one pattern for each of these terrestrial insect categories. And we're going to talk about those. And before I do that, though, I want to tell you why I like these patterns and what I'm looking for. And believe it or not, these are actually fairly universal. It doesn't really matter which type of terrestrial pattern you're fishing. You're probably going to want these same 2 features. And the first one is visibility. Okay, so if you can't see the fly, and everybody who's fly fish knows this, if you're dry fly fishing and you can't see the fly, you're not going to catch any fish. In addition to being very frustrating and kind of uncomfortable to be squinting all day trying to see a damn fly, if you can't see a fish eat it, you're not going to catch it. And that means that the fly has to, number 1, stay on top of the water, and number 2, it has to be visible to you as a human. And there are a couple ways to deal with that. My preference is to deal with it with a wing, which we'll talk about here in a second. But there are a lot of patterns out there that you can find online or elsewhere that don't really have anything that looks like a visibility marker. And they might look great on a hook, but they don't look great in the water, and they will cost you fish. The other thing that I really need to think about whenever I'm tying these flies, and that you need to think about when you're using them, is flotation. How buoyant are they? How well do they float? And that is actually closely tied to visibility, because obviously if the fly is underwater, it can be hard to see, but also it affects how the flies fish. So in general, you want your dry flies to be on the surface of the water. Now, there are some exceptions to that. I have had days where sinking a hopper or sinking a caddis pattern has been the ticket. So I'm not saying that this never happens. But I am saying that in general, you want your dry flies to stay on the surface. They need to stay buoyant. And in the case of these terrestrial patterns, that usually means that you have to have enough foam and thick enough foam, because the ones that I use at least are usually tied with foam, that they stay on the surface. They need to be visible, and they need to stay on the surface, and they need to be buoyant enough that they can hold a nymph underneath. Because almost always you're going to be fishing these as dry droppers. Now, could you fish them as just a single dry? Sure. Could you fish them as a double dry? Sure. But usually, if you're going to be throwing one of these rigs, it's going to be a hopper dropper rig, right? You're going to have a big buoyant dry fly up top in the form of a grasshopper, maybe a beetle, maybe an ant, but probably a grasshopper, and then a nymph hanging off the bottom of it. Usually a beadhead nymph for me, so it's got a little bit of extra weight to it. I want to make sure it can get down in the column below that dry pretty well. But, there are a whole bunch of different ways that you could go about this. The point is you're going to want to have a terrestrial pattern that floats pretty well. So visibility and flotation. Those are the two big things I'm thinking about, in addition to the fact that I'd prefer that these be easy to tie. Now, for reasons I don't understand, there are a million really complicated terrestrial patterns out there. Some of them use a million different materials. Some of them involve you folding foam 6 different ways like origami. Some of them are just wildly complex for reasons that, to be honest with you, I don't fully understand. I think they might be just for the sake of whoever's tying them, but not for the fish, because I can't come up with a reason that a lot of the air quotes features of those flies actually would make any difference in a fishing scenario. But I would like them to be easy to tie, right? I'm a busy guy. I like to spend time fishing. I also like to tie, but I prefer to spend less time tying a pattern. I like it to be simple. I like it to be quick, and I like it to use just a few materials. So those are all the caveats that I'm going to give you about terrestrial patterns and what I am looking for when I'm selecting my favorite terrestrial patterns. Now, drum roll, please. Here are my actual go-to terrestrial patterns in those 3 categories: hoppers, beetles, and ants. On the hopper side, I really only tie and throw one hopper pattern, and it is the GFA hopper. I have mentioned that on the show before. It is a bone simple hopper pattern, only a few materials. It is some peacock herl, some 2 or 3 millimeter foam, a little bit of elk hair for the wings, so you can actually see the thing on the water, and the elk hair really works, in my opinion, a lot better than yarn in a lot of instances, in particular because of the way that it sheds water, which incidentally is the same reason that elk hair caddis are such good flies. But also, it is just a super duper simple fly to tie. It's not complicated. It's not hard. You put some foam on a hook. You put a little bit of peacock herl on that hook shank. You put a little bit of a wing on top. You make one fold in the foam, and you put some legs on it. And bada bing, bada boom. You've got a GFA hopper. GFA, for anybody who's interested, stands for General Foam Attractor, which is to say that you could use the same pattern probably for a whole bunch of different things. You could use it as a weird looking stonefly attractor. You could use it as just a random, there's a bug in the water attractor, but it really does look like a grasshopper. And it does a pretty damn good job of imitating hoppers, in my opinion. So good, in fact, that I really don't use another hopper pattern. Now, I have tied probably, I don't know, a dozen or so hopper patterns. I have probably fished 20 different hopper patterns over the course of time that I've been out there slinging bugs around. And I have not found one that meets all of my criteria as well as this one does. It's highly visible because of that elk hair wing. It is very buoyant because of that thick foam, and it's super quick and super easy to tie. So I might do a video of how to tie one of these at some point. For those of you who are interested, I could throw it up on Instagram. I'll take a look at doing that. But in the meantime, the GFA hopper is my go-to for hopper patterns. On the beetle side, there are 20 bajillion beetle patterns, and I find that 95% of them are almost impossible to see. They're too small, they're too black, they're too difficult to see. Even if you tie a wing on them, I find them hard to see. They ride pretty low in the water column, which, to be honest with you, you kind of want. You actually want your hoppers to ride pretty low in the water column because those bugs are fairly heavy. They actually sit sort of bulging in that surface film when they're floating on the water. So riding low is not bad from a fishing perspective, from trying to trigger that strike. But the beetles in particular, because they're small, can be really, really, really hard to see in the water. which means you really want one that's got a really good wing, a really good visibility feature on it of some kind. And I have not found a better pattern than the hippie stomper for this. Now, the hippie stomper is kind of a weird one because it checks two of the boxes really cleanly. It's highly visible and it's very buoyant. Okay. But it's not the easiest fly in the world to tie. I am sure that there is an easier fly out there to tie that meets these criteria as well. But I've been using hippie stompers for so long, and I think they work so well that it's hard for me to get away from them. And in their defense, the more you tie of them, the easier they get, which, I mean, I suppose that's true of every pattern, but the hippie stomper in particular goes from being sort of a cuss it yourself, difficult fly to tie to becoming really pretty simple and only taking a few minutes once you've really got it down pat. But I find that those work great in a whole bunch of different scenarios. They look like beetles, but they can also look like just random bugs in the water. I do think they imitate hoppers fairly well because they're sort of a weird amorphous shape. They're very, very floating because they often have two different layers of foam, not just one layer of foam like the GFA hopper, and they really work wonders. They're also somewhat indestructible because of how they're tied. I've very rarely had a hippie stomper come apart, which means that by the end of the summer, I can have stompers in my box that still have tooth marks on them from like, I don't know, 50 or 100 fish that have eaten them. They're very, very durable flies because of how they're put together and the materials that they use. So that is my go-to on beetle patterns. An ant pattern, I just use parachute ants. And I'm going to level with you guys. I'm just going to be straight up with you. I actually don't have ant patterns in my box probably 80% of the time. There is a row for ant patterns in my dry fly box. I do sometimes throw them. I particularly use ants in stillwater situations. Grasshoppers and beetles do okay in stillwater situations, but I think ants do really well, in part because they tend to exist in elevations and areas where hoppers and beetles are a little bit more sparse and are very windy. So, like a high alpine lake, for instance, lots of wind. And there may be hoppers up there who get blown into the lake, but there are definitely ants. And the ants will get picked up because they're so small and thrown into the water. And as a result, they kind of sit right there by the shoreline, right in that zone. And they can be really effective stillwater patterns. So I will occasionally have ant patterns in my box, but it's not a common carry for me. It's not something that I use all the time. There are people who swear by ant patterns. I have caught fish on them. I do think they work. Do I think that they work so well that I would feel deprived or naked by not having an ant pattern on me? Not really. Have I ever seen a situation where the fish will only eat an ant pattern and nothing else? No, I haven't. Does that mean it would never happen? No, anything can happen. But I sort of view these as like a secondary pattern. I might throw them on there if I'm playing around. I might throw them on there in very specific situations, but they definitely do not sort of occupy the same band of usefulness for me as the hippie stomper and the GFA hopper. That said, if you want to throw an ant, you're not going to do better than a parachute ant. Super simple to tie. It's just got a couple body sections on it. It has a yarn wing on it, usually, although you can tie it with a fur wing like elk hair or deer hair or whatever you want. And they're fairly visible. They tend to be pretty small, obviously, because ants aren't super big. So they're still a little bit of a pain to see, but you can alleviate that. They're quick to tie and they're buoyant enough to work as single dry flies. Now, I will put the caveat on here that most ant patterns, including the parachute ant, really are not buoyant enough to do well in a dropper configuration. So that dry fly, just because of the way they're tied and how tightly packed that material is not necessarily going to stay afloat with a nymph hanging off the bottom of it. So keep that in mind. This is probably a single dry situation if you're going to fish one. That is sort of your go-to ant pattern if you are looking to fish ants. Okay, so those are my patterns. Now, why would you tie these patterns on? Okay, what is the big attraction to fishing terrestrial patterns? Why would you do it? When would you do it? And more importantly, how would you do it? As far as why goes, there are really two main reasons. The first one is these are very high calorie insects, which means that they're actually pretty important food sources for trout. Now, when I say important, let me be careful here. They are not important in the way that, say, midges are important, or betas are important, or certain types of nymphs are important, or stoneflies are important. They're not necessarily that important. Those are staple insects in the trout's diet. They need those, especially midges. That's what keeps them alive, especially through the hard winter months and through those sort of long stretches when there aren't big hatches coming up. But even then, the other insects are down there, their nymphs are down there, and they're a really important part of the trout's diet. Terrestrials are, I think of them as like a delicacy for a trout. These are like the porterhouse steak fly of the dry fly world, right? We've talked about porterhouse steak flies as nymphs, so Pat's rubber legs, big stonefly patterns, whatever that might be. That's kind of what these are for the fish. These are big, calorie dense, juicy, delicious steaks, basically, that just sometimes fall in the water and are a treat for the trout. And you can sort of intuitively understand this, right? Because it's very rare that you're standing in a river and there are like thousands of grasshoppers floating down the river, or thousands of beetles. You're just not going to see that very often. Certainly not the same way you would see it with like a caddis hatch or a big mayfly hatch. You just don't see it as often. And so they're bugs that are on the sides of the river. They sometimes fall in the river, and when they do, they provide a high opportunity, high calorie meal for the trout. And so they're important to the trout in that way, which is to say that the fish get pretty excited about coming up and eating these. Not necessarily because they would die without them, they probably wouldn't, but because these are opportunities to get some additional calories. So they're effective flies in the summertime. That's why these things work so well, especially in small streams, creek fishing, and sometimes high alpine lakes. They're really an opportunity that the fish can't resist, which is what makes them so awesome to fish and why they're so effective. But also, because of that, they're also just really fun to fish, right? So these are awesome flies to throw around because the strikes are crazy violent. I find that fish hit terrestrial patterns and grasshoppers in particular way harder than they hit any other type of dry fly, right? You hear about trout coming up and sipping mayflies or sipping caddis flies. And yeah, you might see some trout leaving the water during a caddis hatch because those things kind of shoot out and try to get away as quick as possible. But they don't really hit anything as hard as they do terrestrial patterns. As a result, if you're a visual person, which if you're fishing dry flies, you are. That's why you're doing it, because it's awesome to have the visual of a fish eating a dry fly. It just doesn't get better than that. They come up, they swipe at it, they rip at it, they come out of the water on it. It's just really, really violent takes on these things, which is a ton of fun for dry fly fishing. And I believe, and now I can't prove this, right? So once again, there's no magical spreadsheet. I can't demonstrate this to you mathematically, but based on my experience and a lot of time out there, I find that I reliably catch larger fish on terrestrial patterns on the surface than I do on smaller mayfly or caddis patterns, or really any other kind of pattern, including stonefly patterns. Now, the reason for that, I believe, is that those fish are typically hiding a little bit lower in the water column. They're less likely to come up to the surface, in part because they're bigger. And it takes more energy to move around like that, unless there's a huge meal waiting for them at the end of it. And they're just kind of smarter, right? For a fish to get that size, he or she's been in that river for quite a long time. And so they become pretty savvy. And the result of that is that they're not going to move for just anything, right? But if you dangle a porterhouse steak up above them, floating down the river, even those fish will often come up to get that. So I've very often thrown a hopper into a pocket behind a rock or something like that, where, a couple small fish might be lurking in there, but then the big daddy fish, the sort of alpha fish of that pocket, will come up and just hammer that thing. And these fish are much larger than the average in the creek, right? So talk about a creek where you're catching like 6 to 8 inch fish. Those will eat hoppers too, of course. But you really start working those things, you might catch yourself a 15-inch fish in there who wasn't going to move for anything else. He certainly wasn't going to come up for like a size 18 caddis, but man, he came up for a size 10 grasshopper, and it is an awful lot of fun to catch those fish. So there are a lot of good reasons to be throwing these patterns around. There's a lot of good reasons to be tying them. There are a lot of good reasons to keep them in your box. One, they catch fish. Two, they're a lot of fun. And three, every now and then you're going to find fish who this is really what they want to eat, and they're more excited about it than anything else. So if you're a dry fly person, that's why you're thinking about terrestrials a lot of the time, or why you should be, I should say. But then there's the question of how you actually fish them, right? So you're out there, it's hopper season, you've established that it's hopper season, you've established that you want to fish a hopper, they're a lot of fun, you tie one on, and then what? How do you do it? This is where you start thinking about how to set yourself up and how to get your rig ready to fish. So just starting with that, I'll tell you how I set mine up. Number one, Same rig as always, right? You guys have heard me talk about this a million times. There is a 9 foot tapered extruded leader down to a uni knot on a 2 millimeter tippet ring. Then I have 10 to 12 inches, maybe a little bit less depending on where I am and what I'm fishing, a 5X tippet with a Davy knot off of the bottom of that tippet ring. That runs to my GFA hopper in this case. So tie that on, Davy knot as always. Davy knot off the bend of that hook. It's usually about a size 10 GFA hopper. I sometimes fish size 8s. I will sometimes fish size 12s. It depends on what's going on. It's almost always tan or brown. I really don't mess around with green hopper patterns. Now, depending on where in the country or the world you happen to be, that might be different. There's nothing wrong with fishing other colors. I see guys fishing blue hopper patterns and yellow hopper patterns and bright green and purple hopper patterns, and I'm sure that they work. But my experience has been that most grasshoppers live somewhere in that weird universe of like tan or brown-ish stuff or beige or whatever. They're kind of that color. So almost all of my hoppers are brown or tan. Tie that on, and then it is a Davy knot off the back of that hook, about let's say 12 to 14 inches of more 5X tippet there. Depends on how deep I'm fishing and how low I want that nymph to ride in the water column. And then another Davy knot onto the beadhead nymph. Now, that nymph could be one of many things. You can decide what you want to use. Mine might be one of my patented flirty dirtbag flies. It could be a prince nymph. It could be a hare's ear. It could be a midge. I mean, it just depends on what I want to throw on there and when I happen to be fishing and where I happen to be fishing. But in any case, that is your typical hopper dropper setup. Okay. Now, once you have that set up, you are ready to go fish. But there are a couple things you need to think about here. First, casting those big dry flies is a little bit different than casting those little delicate elk hair caddis or parachute Adams or anything like that. They just feel different because they have more weight to them, first of all. So there is some weight on the line. And second of all, they are more air resistant just because they're larger, right? You're talking about bigger flies with sort of pretty big foam profile, and they catch more air resistance when you're throwing them, which means they're a little bit harder to cast sometimes. They're a little bit harder to control. They're more susceptible to wind, and your cast kind of needs to slow down a little bit. All right. So almost everybody who fishes dry flies, me included, to be honest, could benefit from slowing down their cast. There's a big tendency to rush that cast, and that leads to tailing loops. It leads to all sorts of issues that you can avoid easily by just slowing down. But that's especially true with terrestrial patterns. You really got to give that line a chance to unfold behind you. You want to keep your loop nice and open. You don't need it super duper tight, and you don't really want it super duper tight with one of these rigs on the forward stroke. And you want to make sure that that is all very smooth and very controlled, because these rigs can get kind of haywire. If you have a little bit of wind going across you or in your face, which is even worse, or even from behind you, which can also be terrible, you can get yourself tailed up and twisted up pretty quickly. Or at the very least, you can miss what you're casting at. And one thing I will say is that very often you only get 1 or 2 shots with these at a fish. I don't know exactly why that is. I think it's because of the level of water disturbance that they're putting on the water, paired with the fact that the fish just, as we said, they don't see these all the time. And so if they watch you drop a hopper in front of them 50 times, they're kind of like, well, that's weird. I know 50 grasshoppers didn't just fall in the water, so something's going on here and I'm not going to eat them. Yes, I'm aware that trout can't really reason. I understand that I'm anthropomorphizing them a little bit, but seriously, I do think that they believe it's kind of weird to see that many grasshoppers fall in the water over and over and over again, and it kind of puts them on edge. So I find you really only have 1 or 2 shots at these fish, and that means casting quality matters. So really slow down that cast, wait for the wind if you need to, because these are going to catch the wind, or adjust for the wind if you feel like you are comfortable enough with doing that to make sure the cast lands, and just take your time with the cast. It's not a rush. You don't have to be in a hurry. Just slow down on this cast. Trust me, it'll save you a lot of headaches and a lot of tangles later. Once you have done all that, you've got to put this in the right spot. And this is where things get kind of interesting. Okay, so hoppers, obviously, and terrestrials in general, live on land, which means in a stream situation, they are really going to be mostly along and near the banks. Kind of the same thing with lakes, to be honest with you. They're going to be near the shoreline. But in a stream situation, these things are mostly near the banks, which means they are going to be most effective near the banks, and particularly near rocks where something could fall off a rock into the water, underneath low-hanging tree branches, near bushes, near tall grass that is exposed to the wind, anywhere where there might be a chance for a bug to miss and jump in the water or fall in the water or get knocked in the water. That's where they're going to work the best. And during the warmer months, fish kind of hold in those spots, in part because they're often sort of slower current. They're easier for the fish, which is important because trout, as you know, are trying to conserve energy at all times. And they do that by hiding out in usually water that's a little softer, a little less heavy. And there's a lot of that near the banks in most streams. But also because I think they will hang in areas where they know terrestrials might be present during those warmer months. Right. And you think about a fish, once you're sort of living in a universe where you're eating your normal diet of nymphs and small bugs and everything else, but you know that a couple times a day, the grasshopper accidentally falls off this rock or falls off that tree or falls out of that bush, and to here you get a snack, you have an incentive to sort of hang in that particular lie, waiting for those bugs to show up. And so these patterns really do well along the bank. They really, really do. So throwing them underneath a tree branch that's sticking out over the river, especially if there's like a soft water pocket or a seam underneath that tree. Next to grass, like I said, even in pretty skinny water next to grass, you'd be surprised how many fish might be hanging in an undercut bank right there or lurking and looking at the shoreline waiting for that to happen. They work really well there. And pocket water, they work very, very well. That is particularly true near the banks, but it can be true across the whole river. Grasshoppers can fly, as you probably know. So can many beetles. So can some ants. And so they do get out into the river and land on rocks. And those rocks provide a place for them to sit, to sun themselves, to hunt on their own, to do whatever they're doing. They also provide a place for them to fall off into the pocket behind those rocks. And so I very often have great luck, really at any place in the river, throwing these patterns, bouncing them off of a rock, and letting them land in that pocket right behind the rock. And you'll be surprised at how quickly fish come up and hit these things. Now, this is true no matter where you cast them. You need to be ready to go because they very often will hit them the instant they touch the water. I mean, at like literally half a second after they touch the water, the fish are nailing it. So you got to be ready to go right out of the gate. But that's especially true in pockets because very often the bug will land in the pocket and the fish only has a second. He's hiding underneath the rock, looking up toward that sort of smooth surface where the current is not touching the pocket, waiting for his next meal. And he's going to shoot up and try to grab it before it gets caught in the seam or caught in the eddy and sucked off down the river. So they're pretty quick about this. And man, I can't tell you how many times I have thrown a hopper against a rock, bounced it off that rock, let it land neatly in that pocket, and had a fish on the line in literally under a second. So that's a very effective place to put them as well. If you want to just fish them all over the river, which let's be real, I mean, there's something to be said for changing flies and being thoughtful. I do it too. But also, like, if I have a hopper dropper rig on, I'm probably going to be fishing the hopper dropper rig for most of the day. So if you want to fish this in other parts of the river, let's say a riffle out in the middle of the river, or even like a tail out or another situation or run, you still can. But I've noticed something that I think will be a good sort of tip for you to keep in mind. Trout are willing to forgive questionable stories about aquatic insects, which is to say that they're not as inquisitive about why a nymph suddenly appeared right in front of their face 6 inches ahead of them. Same thing with dry flies, because caddis are fairly erratic, mayflies are fairly erratic. You can kind of drop one on the water at any point, and the trout are used to it because the behavior of those insects is that they go and touch the water or land on the water even to lay their eggs or to dry their wings after they hatch or whatever. The trout are used to them being all over the place. Terrestrials aren't really like that. So if a fish is holding in the middle of a river and there are no overhanging branches and it's a pretty wide river and there's no grass there and there's no rock there, the likelihood of there being a terrestrial falling out of space into that run is relatively low. Now, does that mean that a fish will never come up and eat a grasshopper that you just toss haphazardly into a riffle right above its head? No, it doesn't. You probably will catch fish that way, and especially in backcountry areas where the fish are not as sophisticated as they might be elsewhere. Does it mean that you have to be super sophisticated and believe that the trout understand more about where these bugs are coming from than they let on? No, not necessarily. But I will tell you what I have noticed, which is that with terrestrial patterns in particular, trout want you to tell them a story. They need a coherent narrative of how that bug came to be in front of them before they're willing to commit to it. And so along the banks or near rocks, they already have this sort of built in, right? There's something, a dry piece of land or vegetation or a rock where a bug could exist, and it falls in the water and the trout eats it. Story's there. That's the whole story. Bug on rock, bug falls in water, I eat bug. That's the trout's version of what happened in this tale. Out in the middle of the river with just open water, they don't have that same thing, right? And grasshoppers usually don't fly very far, and they're not usually hovering over the surface of the water. And so if you just drop a bug there, the fish might come up and get it, but they're either wary of it or they're just not expecting it because they're like, well, why the hell would there be a grasshopper here to begin with? And as a result, I find that I have very much less success with these patterns, just chucking them into riffles or water of any kind out in the middle of a stream, unless I can tell a better story. And you might say, well, Ross, that's a crazy thing to say. How do I tell a better story with my terrestrial fly? And the answer to that is you throw it well upstream of where you think the fish is sitting. So let's give you a classic example of this. You are sitting right below, you're casting upstream. You are standing right below either a plunge pool or right below just a little bit of a drop off where you have sort of a riffle dumping into a pool or dumping into a deeper channel or a slot. And you're standing below that and casting into it. If you cast directly into that slot or that pool or that channel, the fish are going to kind of be like, oh, well, there's a grasshopper here suddenly, but they're sort of not prepared for it, right? They're living in a place where they're looking for bugs underwater. They're looking for other stuff, and they may not be ready to eat that terrestrial. But if you throw it above that, so that now the fly is not landing just smack on top of them in that pool or in that cut, but is instead washing down naturally over the rocks and through that riffle and then into the pool. Well, now the trout have a narrative because they might not be looking right over their heads for hoppers to fall out of the sky because they know there's not really a particularly good reason for hoppers to be there. But I guarantee you they are looking for bugs that might happen to be washed down over those rocks and into the pool, which means that if you throw a grasshopper above it and let it wash down in, the fish are sitting there waiting for food to wash into them. They will see that grasshopper. It does come with a cohesive narrative. It was fell into the water somewhere else, then it washed down here, and now it's washing into my zone, my feeding zone, exactly the way the other food is, and it's a big juicy thing. That is a cohesive enough narrative for a trout to come up and eat the terrestrial or the grasshopper reliably, I have found. So I really spend a lot of time thinking about if I were a fish, and I know this sounds insane, so just bear with me here. But if I were a fish, what would I expect here? Would I expect the grasshopper to fall out of space and land on my head? No, probably not. Would I expect it to be washing down from further upstream, maybe the next bend or a rock garden further up or a down tree or whatever? That I would probably be expecting, and that is enough to get me to come up and eat the fly. So this is kind of true with all flies. It's worth always thinking about the story you're telling the trout, but especially with terrestrials, I really do think they've got to have some type of coherent reason for that thing to be there for them to work as effectively as these flies can work in a lot of situations. So keep that in mind. You might disagree. I can't prove it. I don't live in the head of a trout. It's very possible that they're not as smart as I think they are, or that they're far smarter than I think they are. It's hard to say, and we can't prove it. So you may have your own thoughts and philosophies on this. I have had this argument, well, discussion with many guides and many anglers. Everybody seems to have sort of a different feeling about this stuff. But that is what I have noticed in my travels, particularly in the types of streams that I fish and the locations where I fish. This has been sort of my go-to set of tactics for when I'm throwing any type of terrestrial, but especially a hopper dropper rig. The same thing is true in high alpine lakes, right? Or really any lakes, to be honest with you. The likelihood that a grasshopper is going to fly and land randomly 30 feet out into a lake, relatively low. Same reason that it's not super likely that there's going to be a grasshopper in like a really, really deep pool or really, really deep section of a river out in the middle of a river. It's just not likely to happen. That's not a likely feeding scenario for a trout. And so in lakes, In general, you want to fish these things relatively close to the shore or in a place where there's some plausible reason for them to be there. So think like if you're a, I don't know, 3/4 of an inch grasshopper, or maybe a little bit smaller, maybe a little bit bigger. How far would you reasonably expect the wind to blow you out into a lake? Are there logs nearby? Is there vegetation nearby? Are there overhanging trees nearby? That's kind of where these things work best in lakes. Kind of the same as rivers, but a little bit different. I usually fish these in high alpine lakes really pretty close to the shore. So think like within 10 feet, right in that sort of littoral zone where the fish, usually cutthroat, but sometimes brookies, sometimes others, are cruising looking for food at the shoreline where the water is warmer, there's more vegetation, there's more bug life, and yes, there's more of a possibility and a reason for there to be terrestrial flies present in those areas, or terrestrial insects present, I should say. So they really fish best close to the shore. Fishing a terrestrial like out of a boat in the middle of a lake, you can do it. I have done it. You can catch fish doing that. I'm not saying it doesn't work ever. It's probably not the most effective thing to be doing. Fishing that same pattern right up against the weed bank or right up against the shoreline or right on a drop off, that makes an awful lot more sense and will catch you an awful lot more fish if you're judicious about it, right? And as always, if it's not working, you can always swap flies. But if you want to fish terrestrials, which I very often do in the summer months, the best thing that you can do is to be mindful of where those things would exist in this really cool, complex ecosystem that we're interacting with, and then mimic that, not just the fly, not just the pattern, but where in the ecosystem that would make sense to exist. And you will find that you will catch more fish that way because nature knows what it's doing, and the fish may not be rocket scientists, but they know a couple things, and they know where that hopper's supposed to be and where it's not supposed to be, or at least I believe that they do. Now, listen, I've had variations of this discussion slash argument with a whole bunch of different guides, various people. Everybody has very strong opinions about fly fishing. Hoppers are no different. Terrestrials are no different. There are plenty of people out there that'll be like, that Ross guy, he's ant patterns are where it's at. Okay, fine. Or you should never throw a grasshopper before July. Okay, fine. Or you should fish them over here. Okay, fine. That's all fine. You can figure out how you'd like to do it. That's the beauty of fly fishing. It's a very creative sport. You can do whatever you like. But from my perspective, from a guy who really, I'm sort of addicted to these things. I fish hoppers in some form or fashion, probably, boy, I don't know, 60 or 70% of the time I'm out there in the warmer months. These are the patterns that I've noticed, and this is the way that I fish them. However you decide to fish them, I really hope that you will fish them. If you don't have these patterns in your box, especially grasshopper patterns, you are really missing out on what I think is kind of the apex of the sport. So go get yourself some, tie some up, make sure that box is ready to go. And man, the first time you see these things on the bank, whip it out, tie it on, and give it a shot. I almost guarantee you, you're going to have a blast doing it, and you're not going to want to go back to those little tiny dries after you see these fish coming up and just smashing these awesome insects. So I think that'll do it for today, guys. There's a lot more we could talk about. There are a million other patterns. There's obviously tons of tactics. There's a lot of stuff we could get into here, and I'd be happy to do that at some point. Feel free to send me your questions. But as far as a general overview of terrestrial flies and terrestrial patterns, how to fish them, when to fish them, which ones to use, I hope this is at least enough to get you started. And it should be enough to get you started right about at the right time, at least out west where it's a little bit warmer, for these bugs to start showing up and for you to be able to start having fun with them. So get out there, slap a hopper on that rig, get a dropper rocking, go rip some lips, and I will look forward to seeing you back here next week. Till next time, this is Ross, and maybe I'll see you out there. I really hope you're fishing a hopper.